The first thing I heard that morning was silence. Not peaceful silence. Not the kind you enjoy with a cup of coffee before the day begins, but the kind of silence that makes your stomach drop because something important has just stopped working. My name is Ethan Carter. I am 39 years old, and at the time this happened, I was living in a quiet neighborhood outside Arlington, Virginia, working from my home office on projects that most people would never even know existed. I was used to strange hours, security checks, and keeping certain parts of my job private, but I was not prepared for the reason my entire system suddenly went dark. One second I was reviewing technical data, and the next my screen froze, my connection disappeared, and every backup route I had available failed. At first I thought it was a normal outage. Maybe a storm knocked something loose. Maybe a local provider had a problem. Maybe it was just one of those annoying things that happen when you rely on technology. But when I stepped outside and opened the utility box near my driveway, I immediately knew this was different. The fiber line running into my home had been cut cleanly in half. Not damaged, not accidentally broken. Cut. Someone had walked up with a tool and deliberately severed it. I stood there for a few seconds just staring at it, trying to understand what kind of person looks at a cable connected to someone else's house and thinks, yes, I have the right to destroy that. The answer came about 20 minutes later when I called the Homeowners Association office. The woman who answered was named Linda Whitmore, the president of our HOA. If you have ever met someone who believes a small title gives them unlimited power, then you already know the type of person I am talking about. Linda was the kind of person who could turn a conversation about trash cans into a courtroom argument. She kept binders full of neighborhood rules, sent emails at midnight about lawn decorations, and somehow always found a reason why everyone else was doing something wrong. I was not surprised when she answered the phone with a tone that sounded like she had been waiting for my call. I asked if she knew anything about my damaged line, and there was a short pause before she said, yes, I had it removed. I remember sitting there at my desk, phone in my hand, thinking I must have misunderstood her. I asked what she meant by removed. She said the cable was an eyesore. It crossed an area she believed belonged to the HOA, and she decided it needed to go. Then, instead of apologizing, she started explaining how I was actually the one who had caused a problem. She told me I owed the association $3,000 for unauthorized installation and another monthly fee because, according to her, I had been using community property without permission. I asked her if she had checked the property records before cutting anything. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed laugh, but the kind of laugh someone gives when they believe they have already won. Then she said something I still remember clearly. She said, Ethan, working from home on a computer is not exactly a real job. Some of us understand what actual service looks like. That sentence bothered me more than the cable itself, not because it insulted me personally, but because it showed how little she understood the world outside her own little circle. She had no idea what I did. She had no idea who relied on that connection. She had no idea that the line she casually cut was not just another internet cable running through a neighborhood. And the biggest mistake Linda Whitmore made was assuming that because something looked ordinary, it must be ordinary. What she did not know was that the cable was connected to a secure communication system installed years before she ever moved into the neighborhood, protected by agreements recorded in official property documents she had clearly never bothered to read. I could have argued with her. I could have yelled. I could have threatened her back. But something inside me told me not to waste my energy. People like Linda usually believe anger is a sign that they have control. So instead, I calmly asked one final question. I said, Linda, are you absolutely certain you want to stand by what you just told me? There was another pause. Then she confidently replied, absolutely. That was the moment I realized this was no longer about a neighborhood disagreement. This was about someone making a decision without understanding the consequences. I ended the call, looked at the damaged line outside my window, and reached for the one phone number I hoped I would never need to use, the number that would change everything. I stared at the phone for a few seconds before making that call because, honestly, I knew the moment I made it, this situation would move far beyond a neighborhood argument. There would be no more back-and-forth emails, no more HOA meetings, no more arguing about whether a cable looked ugly from someone's front porch. This was going to become official, and once that happened, there was no going back. I contacted my security officer and explained exactly what happened, keeping my voice calm and sticking only to the facts. I told him the line had been physically cut, the person responsible had admitted doing it, and there was evidence that the damage might have affected a protected communication system. He did not react dramatically. That was actually what made the next few minutes feel even more serious. He simply asked a few questions, confirmed the location, and said, "Stay where you are. Someone will be there shortly." I remember looking out my window and seeing Linda's house across the street, the same house where she had spent years acting like she was the unofficial mayor of the neighborhood. She had built her reputation on making people follow rules, but she never considered that rules applied to her too. About 30 minutes later, I saw two dark government vehicles pull onto our street. At first, several neighbors stepped outside because, in a neighborhood like ours, any unusual vehicle becomes a full community event within 5 minutes. People started whispering. Someone asked if there had been a break-in. Someone else wondered if it was connected to my outage. I did not say anything because, honestly, I was still trying to process it myself. The situation had become bigger than I expected. Two officials approached my door, identified themselves, and asked me to confirm the details. One of them was from a federal oversight office connected to the department responsible for the system affected by the damaged line. They were professional, quiet, and focused. There was no dramatic shouting, no movie-style confrontation, just people who understood the seriousness of what had happened. After confirming the information, they walked across the street toward Linda's home, and that was when the entire neighborhood watched the woman who always demanded answers suddenly become the person being asked questions. Linda opened the door with the same confident attitude she had used with me on the phone. I could almost imagine her thinking this was another misunderstanding she could talk her way out of. She had convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood. She probably believes she was the hero of the story. But then one of the officials asked her directly if she had personally authorized the removal of the fiber line. At first, she tried to explain that she thought it was a private cable, that she was acting on behalf of the HOA, and that she believed she had the authority to correct violations. Those words might have worked during a homeowners association meeting. They did not work here, because the biggest difference between an HOA dispute and a federal investigation is that facts matter more than confidence. Then came the part Linda never expected. Her own security camera had captured everything. The footage showed her walking outside with cutting equipment, approaching the utility box, and damaging the line herself. There was no misunderstanding, no accidental mistake, no contractor confusion, just a clear decision made by one person who believed she had the power to do whatever she wanted. I watched from a distance as her expression changed. It was not anger anymore. It was realization. The moment when someone finally understands that the rules they use against everyone else can also apply to them. The investigation revealed something even more surprising. The line had been installed decades earlier under a documented federal easement connected to secure communication infrastructure. The information was available on public property records, including documents attached to the land Linda believed gave her control. She had spent years enforcing HOA rules, but she had never bothered to understand the property boundaries she claimed to protect. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. The woman who sent people warning letters for minor violations had ignored the most important paperwork sitting right in front of her. Over the next several days, the full impact became clear. The damage was not just about losing my connection for a few hours. The interruption created a chain reaction involving scheduled work, emergency repairs, and multiple teams that depended on that communication route. Deadlines had to be adjusted, additional resources had to be brought in, and the costs started adding up quickly. What Linda saw as a simple act of punishment turned into a serious financial and legal nightmare. The hardest part for her was realizing that the HOA rules she loved so much could not protect her from consequences. The board members who once followed her every decision began distancing themselves almost immediately. Some admitted privately that they had questioned her behavior for years, but never wanted to challenge her because she was aggressive and intimidating. That was something I found interesting because power often works that way. Sometimes people do not follow someone because they respect them. Sometimes they follow them because they are tired of fighting. Within days, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. The room was packed. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years finally spoke up. They talked about unnecessary fines, hostile messages, and the feeling that one person had turned their community into a place where everyone was afraid of making a mistake. Linda sat there quietly, listening to the same kind of criticism she had delivered to everyone else. The final vote was nearly unanimous. She was removed from her position as HOA president, and new restrictions were put in place to prevent her from holding leadership roles in the association for years. But the story did not end there. A few days later, Linda came to my house. The same person who had laughed at me over the phone now stood at my front door looking completely different. There was no confidence, no attitude, no lecture about neighborhood rules. She looked exhausted. She asked if I would speak to the people handling the case and tell them she never meant for things to go this far. She said she thought she was protecting the community. She said she did not understand what she had done. I listened, and I will admit, part of me wanted to remind her of everything she had said to me that morning. I wanted to tell her about the moment she mocked my work and dismissed my responsibilities. But another part of me realized something important. People sometimes learn lessons only after reality forces them to. I told her I would provide the truth, every detail exactly as it happened. I would not exaggerate, and I would not lie for her. But I also would not pretend the situation was something it was not. The truth was the only thing that mattered. A few weeks later, my connection was restored and upgraded with additional protection. The plain cable that Linda thought was just an eyesore was replaced with a much more secure setup, clearly marked and protected. Every time I looked at it, I thought about how easily one person's arrogance could create consequences far beyond what they imagined. And then I received a phone call that I never expected. It was Linda's son, who was serving in the military overseas. He wanted to apologize for his mother's actions. He told me he understood the importance of the work I did because he knew what service meant. He said he was sorry that his mother had disrespected someone who was trying to support the same mission he was dedicated to. That conversation stayed with me because it reminded me that people are more complicated than the worst thing they do. But being complicated does not mean being free from responsibility. And Linda's biggest mistake was not cutting a cable. It was believing she had the authority to decide what mattered and what did not. Looking back now, the strangest part of the whole situation is that it started with something so small. A cable. Just a thin line running quietly along the side of a house. Something most people would walk past every day without giving it a second thought. But that tiny cable represented something much bigger than anyone in our neighborhood understood at the time. It represented responsibility, trust, and the danger of making decisions without knowing the full story. Linda thought she was fixing a problem. She thought she was cleaning up something that did not belong there. She thought she was standing up for the neighborhood. But the truth was, she was only standing inside a version of reality that she had created for herself. In her mind, she was the person protecting everyone else from violations. She was the person who knew the rules better than anyone. She was the person who had earned the right to make decisions. The problem was that she forgot one important thing. A title does not make someone powerful. Responsibility does. And when someone receives authority without understanding the responsibility that comes with it, that authority can become dangerous. For years, many people in our community had quietly accepted Linda's behavior. They told themselves it was easier not to argue. They avoided unnecessary conversations. They paid small fines they disagreed with because they did not want the stress. They ignored the long emails, the constant reminders, and the way every little issue somehow became a major violation. But after what happened with my cable, something changed. People finally realized the problem was not just one incident. The cable was simply the moment when everyone could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. During the HOA meeting after the investigation began, I watched neighbors who had stayed silent for years finally speak honestly. One woman talked about how she had been afraid to put up holiday decorations because she thought Linda would send another warning. A retired couple explained how they felt like they were constantly being watched instead of living in a community where people looked out for each other. Another neighbor admitted he had disagreed with Linda many times, but stayed quiet because challenging her always turned into an argument. Listening to those stories was eye-opening because it showed me something important. Sometimes the biggest problem in a community is not the person causing the conflict. Sometimes it is everyone else deciding the conflict is not worth addressing. And I understood that because, honestly, before that morning, I had done the same thing. I knew Linda could be difficult. I knew she liked having control. But I also believed that as long as she stayed on her side of the neighborhood and I stayed on mine, we could simply avoid each other. I never expected a disagreement over a cable line to expose something much deeper. After everything was resolved, I thought a lot about whether I would do anything differently. Would I have handled the situation another way? Would I have confronted her more aggressively? Would I have tried to warn her before things escalated? The answer is complicated. A part of me wishes she had simply apologized when I first called. If she had said, "I made a mistake. I did not understand what this was. Let me help fix it," the entire situation could have ended that day. There would have been no investigation. no legal consequences, no public embarrassment. But instead, she chose pride. She chose to defend the decision rather than question it. And that was the turning point, because a mistake can be repaired, but arrogance makes repair almost impossible. I never wanted Linda to suffer. I know some people watching stories like this enjoy the moment when someone who acts entitled finally faces consequences, and I understand why. There is something satisfying about seeing fairness restored, but real life is more complicated than a simple victory. Behind every bad decision is a person, a family, and a future affected by that choice. The goal was never revenge. The goal was accountability. There is a difference. Revenge is about causing pain. Accountability is about making sure someone understands the impact of their actions. And I believe Linda finally understood that. The last conversation I had with her was completely different from our first one. The confidence was gone. The attitude was gone. She did not come to my door to lecture me or tell me about HOA policies. She came because she finally realized she had underestimated the situation. She admitted she should have checked the documents. She admitted she should have asked questions. She admitted she was wrong. And honestly, hearing that meant more than watching her lose her position. Because that was the moment I knew the lesson had actually reached her. Not because someone forced her to say it, but because she finally accepted it herself. My connection was eventually restored, but the new setup looked very different. The old line that had once been ignored and overlooked was now protected and clearly marked. Every time I saw it, I was reminded of how easily people can create huge problems when they act on assumptions. We live in a world where everyone has an opinion, everyone has access to information, and everyone feels like they need to be right. But sometimes the smartest thing a person can do is stop for a moment and ask a simple question. Do I actually know what I am dealing with? Because if Linda had asked that one question, none of this would have happened. She would have learned the truth before making a decision. She would have avoided putting herself, her family, and the entire neighborhood through months of stress. And maybe that is the real lesson from this story. The things we do not understand deserve curiosity, not destruction. The people we disagree with deserve conversation before judgment. And power without wisdom is one of the fastest ways to create a disaster. I still live in the same area, and every now and then I see Linda around the neighborhood. Things are different now. She keeps to herself more. She is no longer walking around looking for violations or trying to control every detail. Maybe losing that position was exactly what she needed. Maybe sometimes people have to lose the thing they are holding on to too tightly before they realize it was never really theirs to control. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever dealt with someone who used a small amount of authority, like it made them untouchable? Maybe it was an HOA president, a manager at work, a neighbor, or someone in your community who forgot that respect goes both ways. Did they ever realize they were wrong? Or did they keep pushing until they faced the consequences? Share your story in the comments, because these situations happen more often than people admit, and sometimes the best lessons come from hearing what others have experienced. And, if you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who believes power means they never have to answer for their actions. Because at the end of the day, the biggest lesson is simple. Rules matter. Responsibility matters. And no matter who someone is, everyone eventually has to answer for the choices they make.